Most Christian leaders in the first 3 centuries were educated in the classical tradition, which means they knew the teachings of Plato, the teachings of Aristotle, the teachings of Euclid, and later the teachings of Ptolemy and of Galen. They knew and embraced the science of the day. They did disagree with Aristotle and with Greek philosophy when it led to atheism, but they used Greek science and Greek philosophy to defend and argue for Christianity. In those same first 3 centuries, natural science, philosophy, and theology all were part of the same enterprise. Knowledge of the natural world and acceptance of the science of the day within the Christian worldview was just the normal state of affairs. And this continued through the 8th century and beyond. It was in this environment that the foundations of modern science were built. The work of the Christian leaders in the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th centuries set the stage for modern science to flourish by establishing crucial and basic ideas that we still use today when we do science. Basil of Caesarea, or who we now call Saint Basil, was well educated at Constantinople and at Athens. He devoted his life to Christ after his education. He agreed with much of Greek science, but did disagree with Aristotle in a couple crucial areas. Aristotle thought that earth, air, fire, and water made up the environment of earth, and that there was this 5th heavenly element that made up the heavens, and that made the heavens incorruptible. Basil disagreed. He thought the same 4 elements made up the heavens also, and that those heavens operated with the same rules as earth. That the stars, for example, were just fire. This break from Aristotle provided one of the most crucial assumptions that we make in science today, that chemistry and physics principles are universal, that what we learn about chemistry and physics on Earth is the same out in the universe. Aristotle also thought that the rules governing nature were necessary, in other words, that they couldn't be otherwise, so there was no need to test different possibilities. Basil thought that physical laws were contingent upon God, which means God chose them and they could have been different. So we needed to test multiple possibilities to discover and see which explanation is correct. So it took a Christian disagreeing with the science of the day based on his Christian worldview to provide the beginnings of 2 of the most basic and important foundations of modern science: the universality of natural laws and the need to propose and test different hypotheses. Basil, as an aside, also thought that the motions of the heavens obeyed God's initial command to move and then just continued in motion, and we're continuing in motion today. And this was a precursor to our modern idea of the conservation of momentum. Augustine of Hippo, or who we now call St. Augustine, was one of the most important church fathers. He also converted to Christianity after a classical education. Augustine wrote at length about the relationship between Genesis and the natural sciences. He had no problem using the science of the day to help interpret Scripture. He thought we could use our reason and our experience to read the book of nature, or do science, because it was created by God. He thought that nature was intelligible. He taught that the science of the day posed no threat to Christianity, and that science could serve as the handmaiden of religion. He taught that faith and reason complemented each other. He taught that the 2 books that God revealed, nature and Scripture, should be read together to understand the fullness of God's revelation. Science is the God-given tool for discerning nature, where Scripture is the God-given tool for determining theology. This helped embolden medieval thinkers to believe that nature was something we could investigate and understand. Augustine was also worried that Christians would use bad science to interpret Scripture, and because of that poor grasp on science would keep people from accepting Christianity. And I think this is a lesson that many Christians should take to heart today. Augustine wanted Christians to know the science of the day and use the good science of the day to defend Christianity and interpret Scripture. One aside in terms of the science of St. Augustine, he taught that matter was created out of nothing and that time was created at the same moment matter was created. an idea that modern science didn't catch up with for 1,500 years. Boethus was a Christian Roman senator in the late 5th century. He synthesized Plato with Christian theology. He taught that inanimate nature obeys God's rules, and this helped to establish the idea of natural laws. Again, a foundational idea of modern science. A Christian monk in the late 7th century, Bede, demonstrated in his works that you can use all accumulated knowledge, both pagan and Christian, to accurately describe divine creation, nature. His works created a foundation for a physical description of nature, the idea that a totally mechanistic universe governed by the laws of cause and effect can operate. And this is another foundation of modern science. So the Christian leaders in the 4th through the 8th century established 3 basic ideas, basic foundations that we still use today in modern science. Number 1, that nature is comprehensible. We can study it, we can understand it, we can then describe it in physical terms using cause and effect. This comes out of 2 crucial Christian doctrines. 1, the idea that nature is created by God but separate from God. And 2, that our minds were also created by God in God's image. So therefore we can discover things about God's creation. Number 2, that physical laws operate the same everywhere in the universe. What we see in terms of chemistry and physics on Earth is the same chemistry and physics operating out in the universe. This unification was lacking in Greek thought. The Greeks thought that the heavens operated differently from the earth. It took Christian theology to correct this. And number 3, we should propose several explanations for how something works and what something is, and then test those different possibilities to see which one is correct. Again, a basic foundation of modern science. This comes out of the Christian idea that nature has its own rules that were established by God, and those rules could have been different. So we can do tests to see which explanation is best, and then think God's thoughts after Him. As an aside, there were 3 important science concepts that Christians got right in the 4th through 8th century. The idea that the universe had a beginning, the idea that time had a beginning, and some precursors to the law of conservation of momentum. Nature and Scripture have complemented each other, even in the so-called Dark Ages. Science and Christianity have had a synergistic relationship throughout history. If you want to learn more about this connection, here are some places you can go.